Al Gore. He's pretty well known for barely losing the 2000 presidential election to George W. Bush, but 2000 wasn't his first time ever running for the presidency. His first time was in 1988, where he came in third place in the Democratic primaries. In our timeline, Michael Dukakis won the Democrat primaries and ran as a liberal Democrat, which opened up many attacks by the H.W. Bush campaign, as Bush was seen as more centrist and moderate than Dukakis by the American people. Dukakis had started out the election leading, but his platform was not well liked and he was very weak on crime, left-wing on many social issues for the time, and wanted to lower defense spending for the Cold War. One of the hardest blows for Dukakis was when he thought that he could be riding in a tank and that would make him seem strong on defense, but this ad would fail spectacularly. Also, Dukakis flopped in the debate as his stances on crime resulted in the revolving door ad campaign. Al Gore was only 39 years old when he made his announcement for president and would have been 40 years old if he had won the election. The 1988 Democrat primaries also saw Joe Biden's first run for the presidency and him dropping out for plagiarism, which I thought was kind of funny, and didn't know where else to put this. Anyway, Al Gore made some pretty strong attacks against Dukakis for weak stances on crime and against Jesse Jackson for being in favor of Fidel Castro and Yasser Arafat, as Jackson was second place. These attacks were very effective at getting his points across, but they were not viewed favorably by the Democrats in the primaries. So in order for him to win the primary, he would have to tone down a lot of his rhetoric. Gore was a conservative centrist Democrat and was a combat engineer in the Vietnam War, which could help him counter potential attacks against him regarding issues such as defense or foreign policy. Even though he didn't get 3 Purple Hearts, he's still a Vietnam vet. Regarding the vice presidency, pretty much any VP choice by Gore will absolutely destroy Dan Quayle in the debate. The question is who is going to be his vice president. On one hand, he could choose a centrist like John Glenn to avoid partisan attacks, or he could try someone like George Mitchell or Chuck Robb to try to appeal more to liberals disaffected by his centrism. But overall, I think that he would still pick Lloyd Bentsen, as Dukakis did, as a moderate pick, but also to help geographically with Texas. Honestly, anyone would defeat Quayle in the debate, but Bentsen had his iconic one-liner, which ended up destroying Quayle's political career. Unlike Dukakis, Al Gore had favored U.S. interventions in Grenada and Operation Urgent Fury, and again, this is not something that the Bush campaign can attack because in the 80s, Gore was pretty in favor of lots of Reagan's policies. But he wanted arms control, and of course, this is Al Gore, so the environment was a big deal to him. The 1988 U.S. presidential election was one of the most important elections in U.S. history in my view, as a whole lot happened on the foreign policy front, and Al Gore's probably the only Democrat who would even have a shot at defeating George H.W. Bush. As president, Gore might still invade Panama, as the Reagan administration was already planning to get rid of Noriega in 1988, and Gore would also feel the pressure from Republicans to invade Panama as he is ready to prove himself as a tough president. So Operation Just Cause likely goes as it did in our timeline in 1989, and a massive drug lord is removed from power. Good job, Al! I do feel like the Tiananmen Square massacre would still go the same as it did in our timeline, and now this video cannot be viewed in China. Turning to the Middle East, the Iran-Iraq war likely ends the same way that it did in our timeline, and Saddam decides to still be an idiot and invade Kuwait. The Gulf War is definitely still happening in this timeline as Gore supported it in ours, but there would be several differences compared to ours. George H.W. Bush was really the best president to have at the time of the Gulf War, as his foreign policy experience was seconded to none. He had previously been a pilot in World War II, the UN ambassador, CIA director, and vice president. Therefore, he knew how to build the coalition to help liberate Kuwait. How Gore would build a coalition is pretty hard to determine. He would likely go through organizations such as the UN to try to build a coalition while also negotiating with allies such as Britain and Egypt. If Gore is to ensure success, he would not hesitate to get his former opponent George H.W. Bush to help him shore up support internationally. But even if he didn't, I think that he could still build somewhat of a coalition together, but it would likely be smaller than the massive coalition that we saw in our timeline. The difference might be that without this massive international coalition, support for the war might be less globally, but it would still be large enough to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. The bombing campaign against Saddam likely goes pretty much the same as it did, where Iraq is absolutely destroyed and as a result of Saddam's invasion. Meanwhile, the ground campaign in Kuwait would also be very similar, with Desert Storm seeing a massive success. However, one thing that will change in the campaign is within Iraq itself, where President Gore sets his sights on Baghdad, as in our timeline, he really wanted to topple Saddam and was very disappointed when Bush decided to pull troops back. Gore is not only supporting the rebels in this alternate timeline, but he's also enacting regime change and toppling Saddam, as in our timeline, Gore stated that he had felt betrayed by the withdrawal by coalition forces from Iraq. So how Al Gore's war against Saddam goes in this alternate timeline where American tanks roll on Baghdad is pretty hard to determine. However, some things to note are that Saddam is very unpopular, most of the Iraqi army was rebelling, Iraq has been bombed back to the Stone Age, and Iran also exists despite still licking its wounds from the Iran-Iraq War. So Gore is going to have to do a lot of nation building after overthrowing Saddam, but unlike the 2003 occupation, this occupation would have a lot of very different conditions and a lot of very different moving pieces here. Moving to the broader Cold War, Gore's administration would likely enact de-escalation policies with the USSR in the late 1980s as the Soviets are gonna fall soon and the people are all enjoying things like McDonald's. The Warsaw Pact collapses as it did in our timeline, but when the Soviet Union falls, it is unknown how Gore would react. With US troops occupying Iraq, President Gore might also do shows of force in the Baltic states to ensure that they get independence from the Soviet Union. And this might provoke the Soviets, and it's possible that the Soviet Union might possibly explode instead of implode, but all of that is beyond my ability to accurately predict this as there are tons of moving pieces similar to the occupation of Iraq in 1991. Domestically, the 1992 recession is gonna hit, and Al Gore would have definitely raised taxes, however he would have not made this part of his campaign and would not have made the same pledge that Bush did to not raise taxes. But nonetheless, Republicans in Congress would undoubtedly constantly attack over Gore raising taxes and would only make things worse with the recession. Gore would also do his fair share of environmentalism because this is Al Gore we're talking about. When the 1992 election rolls around, I do not think it would be a three-way split. Al Gore likely loses to Bob Dole due to the recession, any mistakes that he made in the Cold War, and whatever issues came about from toppling Saddam and occupying Iraq. You see, Ross Perot is not running his third-party campaign as he would have probably run in the Republican primaries, as Perot was previously a Reagan supporter and was only really politically active regarding POWs and MIAs left in Vietnam, as well as conducting a rescue mission to save employees captured during the Iranian Revolution. So Perot runs and eventually throws his support behind Bob Dole, who might make him his potential running mate, and the only concession that Dole would have to make to Perot would be shooting down NAFTA. Dole's first term in office sees the U.S. continue what is happening in Iraq in the 90s and doing nation-building stuff, intervention in Yugoslavia that still breaks apart because, it's the Balkans. Dole would also threaten to invade Haiti in 1994 to get Raul Cedras to step down. And regarding Russia, Dole probably isn't going to do worse than Clinton did in our timeline, so that's probably going to be a good thing. It's not that Russia would be all sunshine and rainbows either, though. It just won't be as bad as it was, or it could be worse depending on how Al Gore ended the Cold War and handled the disillusionment of the Soviet Union. Again, lots of moving pieces there. But one major difference would be humanitarian interventions. It's unknown if Al Gore would have enacted the same intervention in Somalia in the last months of his presidency for Dole to take over, and it's also not known what Gore's administration would have sent into Somalia, so the Black Hawk Down incident may not happen and Somalia might also get overrun by warlords. The main place that this would impact would be how Dole's administration handles the Rwandan genocide. In our timeline, because of how Clinton mishandled the humanitarian intervention in Somalia, the international community used the Black Hawk Down incident as a reason not to do humanitarian interventions, and the Rwandan genocide ended the way it did. With a completely different Somalia situation, Rwanda could see a US and UN intervention under Dole's presidency. How this goes, again, is beyond my ability to predict. Domestically, the economy will see a significant rebound during the Dole administration. Dole defeats Clinton in 1996, but on a slimmer margin than he won by in 1992 against Gore. And in his second term, it would go pretty similar to his first. The economy is good, so Americans generally see Dole as good. In his second term, the Yugoslav Wars comes to an end and the Kosovo War kicks off in 1999. Dole would also put Milosevic in his place with the Kosovo War and NATO airstrikes, just like in our timeline. A lot has changed for the 2000 election as there has been no Clinton administration, which impact how politicized things have become as well as who would be running for office. Dick Cheney was never Secretary of Defense, so he would never be considered to be George W. Bush's vice president, so there's another major change. A completely different George W. Bush runs for the Republican nomination against an unknown Democrat for the new millennium. Maybe Al Gore decides to run again as he had a very impactful administration and is considered young. Or maybe the Democrats likely feel that someone completely new needs to go up against the W. I would probably give this alternate 2000 election to George W. Bush as he would be riding along the Dole high of the economy and boom. But that is all just one possibility for if Al Gore had become president in 1988. What do you think would have happened? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.